I've got pressing Jets questions, and we have a film junkie, one of the best in the gosh darn business, who's going to answer them all right now. Let's get into it, everybody. Zoinks! But it is unequivocally the Super Bowl for New York Jet fans. Field Yates, baby. Field gosh darn Yates. Let's bring him on the show. Come on, people. Connor Rodgers is joining the show. What's up, Connor? But Trevor gosh darn Sycamore, baby, for me, personally, my favorite New York Jet of all time.
Wow, it's great to be on. What an intro that was right there.
Paul, nobody does an intro like you, man.
Paul, you give the best intro of literally any podcast that I've ever been on.
I'm gonna lose my gosh darn bananas. Hey everybody, my name is Paul Esden Jr., aka Boy Green. I'm the New York Jets digital reporter for Heavy.com. We're streaming live right now in 3 different places. Heavy on Jets Facebook page to 30,000 New York Jet fans. My YouTube channel, youtube.com/BoyGreen25, everybody. And of course, on Twitter, @BoyGreen25 as well. But before we get into all that jazz, we got a special guest joining us. It's been a long-ass time. I don't even know when it was, but what I do know is it's been too damn long. So let's bring him in, the film junkie, the film connoisseur, co-owner of the Jets X Factor website, and everything that is including Blewett's Blitz. But let's bring him in. That is Joe Blewett. He is fantastic, and we're bringing him in right now. What's up, Joe?
I appreciate you having me on, Paul. I love the enthusiasm, and I think the last time we talked, we were we were discussing Robbie Anderson. So it's been at least 3 years. It's been at least 3 years, but I'm happy to be back on for sure.
I do remember those times, and I believe those was not. I don't believe that was video. I believe that was the old school. I was in the studio basement of my radio station as we're doing that show. So we've both come a long way, man. So first off, I guess let's kind of reset for an intro for all the new fans and all the new platforms that we're on since the last time we spoke, Joe. How long I described you as a film connoisseur, a tape master of sorts. How long have you been doing this, quite frankly?
I would say I started podcasting probably around like 2016 or 17, maybe feels about right. And then I really started diving into film in probably about 2018, 2019. So like strictly film for about 4 or 5 years, but I've been doing it since I think 2015. That season gave us some false hope, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true. But hey, at least flirt with you a little bit. The last couple of years, there's been no flirtation whatsoever. It's been pretty clear what has been going to happen and then has happened. Although this season has a lot more promising things. And speaking of promising things, Joe, before we dive into all my wonderful questions I have for you, I mentioned it as another one of your bylines as a co-owner of Jets X Factor. You got Robbie Sabo, you got Michael Nania. I mean, you got everything that you guys are doing. And if people don't know, I guess I don't know how many people are currently on the planet, a couple billion. Like there's not a couple billion followers on the Jets X Factor yet. So somebody doesn't know about it yet. What can you tell us if fans are just learning about Jets X Factor for the very first time? What are you guys providing for the everyday Jets fan?
Yeah, we just wanted to get really deep into football. So we got really into the analytics. Obviously, with Michael Nania, I think Michael Nania and analytics are kind of they're tied into one. When you say that, you think of Nania. You have Sabo, who manages a lot of stuff behind the scenes, but he's also a high school football coach who has a really good knowledge in film. And then, as you kind of introduced me, I do a lot of the film stuff. So we really wanted to just bring a really in-depth look into the Jets instead of the more generic stuff that is pretty popular out there. So we wanted to get really, really deep into it. And we've been running for about 3 years now. And just recently we were the #1 Jets website in the world, independent Jets website in the world. So we're doing pretty well. And we really appreciate the support from really everybody. So it's been doing well. So we definitely, like I said, appreciate everybody supporting us. So.
All right. Yeah. What a modest bastard you are. You're like, yeah, we've been doing pretty well. Number one, of course. Number one, the top, the best of the best. Yeah. I don't know how you get higher than number one, but we'll figure that out a different day for all the math people in the room, Joe. But one question, I got a bunch of questions, but one of them off the top of the head is a debate. Not necessarily a debate between me and you yet, but I'm sure we'll get to that on the show. But a debate among Jet fans is the Quan Alexander thing. The third linebacker on the field, the Jets 4-3 scheme, getting into a little bit of the, the nitty gritty with you here. How important is that, not only just from a starting perspective of having that third linebacker on the field, because Quan last year, he appeared in all 17 games, first time he's done that in a long time. And also he started in 12 of those. So 12 of those times he was on the field, obviously, to start a game. How important is that just in terms of a starter level and also the insurance of depth? Because if CJ or Quincy goes down, the Quan, if that happens in future weeks, or Jamie and Sherwood or whoever that guy is, would then be forced up another rung on the ladder.
Yeah, no, it's definitely important. And I think what they tried to do was bring in, Chuck Clark earlier in the offseason, which was a really, really good move by Douglas. A 7th-round pick for a guy who's about $4.5 million. I really liked his game. So I think they were trying to get a little bit lighter in the box in terms of filling in between the tackles and making tackles in the backfield and replacing some of that with some more coverage, because the Jets hopefully plan on being up more, this season than in past seasons. So they wanted a linebacker who can cover a little bit more. So I think that was their initial plan, was to bring in Clark, and now they bring in Amos. I hate how it's pronounced Amos. It's not Amos, it's Amos, but it just sounds weird rolling off the tongue, but it's Amos. So I think they're bringing him in to fill that role that was left by Chuck Clark. But with Quan, I kind of view that as a multi-dimensional type of signing, because Amos could be in the box for you. That's okay. I think he could be okay in that role, even though I do like Chuck Clark more than him. But bringing Quan gives you insurances at two positions, right? Because it's not only if Mosley or Quincy goes down, you can have a guy like Quan, substitute in for one of those guys. But also, if you have Amos in the box, and let's say Tony Adams is struggling at free safety, you can kick Amos to free safety where he's played before, and then Quan can step in for him. So it kind of guards you in two spots. So, he was signed for around $1 million last year. If he can be signed for $2.5 million this year, I don't see why not. Now, I know he only played 40-ish% of snaps, maybe 40 or 50%, but it's still, you hear how highly he's talked about by teammates, by Saleh, by all these guys around the team. So I would love to bring him back just for the sake of, again, multi-dimensional depth at linebacker and at safety. And obviously, he played pretty well last year too. So.
Yeah, of course. And let's go back to the beginning of that answer. You kind of hinted at with, we should be playing with more leads, the Jets in those positions. I just tweeted out a clip tonight of Jeff Ulbrich, which I found fascinating. It was part of the Eric Allen Official Jets podcast. And he said that, he kind of laughed and said that, with Aaron Rodgers, he scores a lot of points. So, that's going to be pretty nice. But with that being said, sometimes when teams attacked the Jets defense last year, they were able to be conservative because the Jets quarterback play wasn't great. So they didn't have to go crazy. They could kind of nickel and dime the Jets and do some of those sorts of things that puts them in certain positions. With Aaron Rodgers, in theory, with more leads, the other team's like, oh, crap, we got to turn the cat backward here and try to make some moves. So Jeff Ulbrich believes one of the weaknesses of the Jets defense was, the lack of forcing turnovers. So if you pair that with a team that may be trying to force it a little, maybe that can kind of give us, I don't know if it's completely luck, but it can kind of tip the scales back the other way potentially here in 2023.
Yeah, because and they did pretty well at getting turnovers to start the season, but then they finished really slow. And like you said, when you're winning games, the Pats beat us 10-3. You don't have to put the ball in harm's way because they knew the Jets offense weren't going to score points. So I know a lot of people look at Sauce's stats. He didn't have a lot of picks. We had a lot of pass deflections, and they hope that they'll go up in the future. But I think it will happen just because, like you said, teams are going to have to throw the ball more because you're not going to be able to beat the Jets 10-3 or 17-16 or anything like that. Obviously, knock on wood, hopefully, if Aaron Rodgers is healthy for the entire season, we're talking the Jets scoring hopefully 20 plus points, a game, and teams actually having to start to throw on the Jets, which will obviously in turn lead to interceptions, lead to strip sacks, leads to fumbles. With all the resources the Jets are pouring into the defensive line, you're hoping that they're going to get to the quarterback if quarterbacks do have to take 5 to 7 step drops. So I think the turnovers will definitely jump up this year for the Jets.
You mentioned Sauce. Okay, this is a point where we may trade fisticuffs, but not because I want to. I just need a sense of clarity here. So Sauce has this crazy year, right? Like unbelievable. I mean, like obviously Pro Bowl, first team All Pro, like all that's and defensive rookie of the year. Obviously, another one. The Jets have actually had a very rich history with cranking out defensive rookie of the years throughout their history. For folks who don't know, but not so much on the offense side. Garrett Wilson being the first one ever there. I think Sauce was so great that I'm kind of like in the same sense that people have said it about the defense. There may be kind of this kind of natural regression. Like they were so good in a lot of areas, although there's a lot of areas they could get better, that maybe instead of being 4th overall, they're still top 10. And Sauce, who is I can't believe this. I don't know if you saw this, Joe, but Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks do this Move the Sticks podcast, and they did almost a fantasy draft for cornerbacks. And they, who gets a first pick? All right. Well, when Daniel Jeremiah won the first pick, what he said is, well, obviously I'm taking Sauce because he's the number 1 corner, and I don't think it's particularly close. And Bucky said, of course, obviously. And then it's just like, I'm pinching myself telling you that, repeating the story to you right now, like, obviously he's the number 1 corner. Duh. Like, that's what they were saying. And I'm like, habita, huh? Like, so is there, and this where, like I said, we may get into a rub here. Is there a natural regression set up for Sauce that he was so great, so fast that naturally, how could he possibly top what last season was? Am I crazy for thinking that? Thoughts?
Yeah, so the only guy who like I could think, and it's hard to quantify because obviously I watch the Jets and I do the film review for the Jets. It's not like I'm out there and watching Darius Slay and I'm not watching Pat Surtain every single rep of their season. I see them in passing, but I'm not watching them rep for rep. So in terms of like guys who I think you might have an argument with Sauce, it's really only him and Pat Surtain. And like how crazy we can say after 1 year that he may be the number 1 or 2 corner in terms of fantasy drafts going forward. So but for Sauce, I don't think there's going to be a natural regression because I think there's actually areas that he can improve. I think Sauce is going to get better. It's not like Sauce was impenetrable last year. Like there were some plays he almost got beat on. The Lazard play across the middle where he got the pass deflection. He was beat on that play. Good recovery speed. The interception against the Dolphins on Skylar Thompson. That ball was late because JFM hit him, but Sauce allowed the guy to attack his blind spot. He would have got a first down if it wasn't for JFM. So he could play a little bit better there. And part of the problem is he opens up a little bit too early and he gets in a shuffle technique, which I'm not going to get too much into. And then there's also a play you see against, the Steelers where Deontay Johnson beat him on a post. He used to get his foot in bounds where he beat him on that. So like there was plays that were there where Sauce got beat. So it's not like I saw somebody who did every single thing perfect and the only thing he could do was go down. I think if Sauce starts to play with a little bit more consistent technique and off coverage, and then if he starts to track the ball better deep. Now, obviously, the whole pass interference thing, it's definitely a reach by Seahawks fans who want to see Tyreek Woolen or whatever it is, as a defensive rookie of the year. And, apparently Sauce is only good because he's in New York, which is a bunch of BS. But nonetheless, he could play balls better deep because there were some calls that might have been a little bit questionable in terms of the pass interference, even though that was more few and far between than those fans want to make it out to be. But if Sauce can keep his feet under him, if you can play balls a little bit better deep, if you can track it a little bit better, I actually think he'll take a step up. So I'm not really expecting a step back from him. I think he'll get better from last year.
Yeah, that makes sense because we just started this, Joe, and I asked you about Jets X. You said, we're number 1, baby. And then you said, there's more to accomplish. And that's Sauce. I'm like, he was just rated number 1. You're like, well, there's more to accomplish. So that makes that your consistent theme. That's what we're looking for, Mr. Joe Blewett here on the show. And again, make sure you follow him on that very handle that you see below that handsome mug of his. Again, Joe Blewett is on the freaking show, everybody. And Joe, I need to ask you this. Let's stay in the secondary. This will be a multi-layered question, but right off the top, how big of an issue, if at all, is the safety position in your mind as we're heading into training camp?
It's really a huge. It's a big question, right? Like I can't say we're in a good spot or a bad spot because it really hinges on a guy who we don't know a lot about in Tony Adams. And you could be as impressed as you want to be in those 2 games against the Dolphins and the Seahawks, where he was actually pretty solid. With that being said, in a year where the Jets are going to be 4-13 or 5-12, I would be willing to say, okay, let's see what Tony Adams has. He impressed a little bit. We'll take our lumps with him in this year. If he's not the answer in 2023, we'll get a guy in 2024. The problem is I don't think you can officially label like a Super Bowl or bust year, but you're not getting Aaron Rodgers to not win the Super Bowl, right? So it's kind of a Super Bowl or bust year. And do you trust a Tony Adams going against the likes of Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes and Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson and Deshaun Watson and a bunch of guys, Russell Wilson even, so there's a ton of quarterbacks he's going to have to face. So do you want to pour all of your faith into Tony Adams to do that? I personally wouldn't. Now, with that being said, do I think Tony Adams could be a good player? Sure. But again, that's built off of a pretty small sample size. So I would like some insurances there. Could they sign a John Johnson to bring in some insurance for him? Because how much is he going to cost? $2-3 million. So I'd like to see some insurance there. And then, you look at the strong safety spot / like hybrid linebacker, because I think that's what you're going to have in a combination of Jordan Whitehead and Amos. You're going to have a strong safety, that third linebacker, that nickel backer type look. So I don't think that's necessarily a strong suit. I don't love Amos's game. I think he's an okay player. And then Jordan Whitehead was obviously pretty disappointing last year, right? So like with a lot of the Jets free agents, we really struck out in terms of like Conklin had like 4 drops in 4 years. He comes to the Jets, he's like 4 drops and a fumble in his first game. You have Laken Tomlinson, who's a Pro Bowler. He comes, he's complete garbage. You have Whitehead, who was supposed to be better than he was. He comes in. So you're hoping this year they kind of get back to their mean of in terms of like their play. So does Whitehead take a step in the right direction? You have to hope so, right? Because he wasn't that bad, at least with the Buccaneers. So I think the safety position is better than last year, just because I really don't think you could do much worse than a LaMarcus Joyner deep. He was pretty bad, minus a few lucky plays where he got some picks and maybe jacked up his grades a little bit. But I think Tony Adams will be better than him. So no matter what, it's going to be better. But I'm not necessarily pouring all of my faith into that spot and saying, yeah, they're going to be able to hold up against Mahomes. And I know that's obviously a tough cookie to crack containing Mahomes, but I'll be a lot more faithful with a guy in John Johnson who's at least done it, quite a few times. And if Tony Adams outplays him, great, then you have great depth. But for a few $1 million, I would like to see another guy brought in.
Let me ask you this. If the safety position is as big of a question mark as a lot of people have said, and even you've kind of painted the picture here, how big of a weakness is that at the end of the day in terms of winning versus losing? So you have Aaron Rodgers, and let's say your biggest or one of your bigger weaknesses is safety. Is that going to prevent you from, winning a game here or there? Is that going to prevent you from potentially winning a championship? Like, I'm just trying to categorize it in terms of the quote unquote first world problems Jet fans now have of like, there's a lot of teams that have a lot of problems that I would argue are much worse than safety. Is that going to be a difference maker ultimately, in your opinion?
I don't think it's going to make the Jets defense from the 12th best defense to the 3rd best defense if they were to bring in a safety, but every single little tick in the right direction matters, right? When you're trying to go for the Super Bowl, obviously you haven't won one in 50 plus years, so the littlest tick you could make to greatening our chances, I don't see the reason to not do it. Now, obviously, we have to talk about contracts. We have to be realistic. Rodgers still has to get paid, and Quinnen Williams still has to get paid. And I know that's really years down the line in terms of the cap hit, not necessarily this year, unless they want to make it this year, but still. So I don't think it's a massive needle mover for the Jets. I still think they will be even with the group right now, a top 5-ish type of defense. Argue 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, somewhere in that range. So I don't think a safety will surefire make them like number 3, but if it's that one play that makes a difference in the Super Bowl, we're going to as of hell wanted that safety. It only takes one play. So if they could bring in a safety, if they could bring in, going to the offensive side of the ball, a receiver or whatever it may be to greaten their chances, why not do it? Because we're going for it all this year.
You mentioned it earlier. When the Jets initially signed Amos, I was like, again, on the surface, at the time we did not know about the Chuck Clark injury. I'm like, oh, phenomenal. Now you have 3 starting caliber safeties on the team. This is kind of what you want, again, to your point of incremental, again, not getting complacent and just trying to improve every bit of your roster. As we found out, unfortunately, a few hours later after that signing became official, is that Chuck Clark went down. So it almost seemed like Amos was a 1-for-1 swap with Clark. How big of a deal is that John Johnson ad that you and several others have kind of advocated for out there? Or is it just going to be this kind of like belief within the team? Like Tony Adams surprisingly making the roster last year from the outside looking in, it was like, oh, so they believe in him, or Trey Dean, or whoever that player is. Is there going to be that kind of belief in, hey, just us on the outside are going to have the bigger question marks at safety than the people inside the building?
Yeah, like there's always info we don't know about, right? Like we
Sure.
spend all this time about the draft and we talk for 3 months about the draft, but we only have 5%, 10% of the information that the teams have. So they know a lot more behind the scenes. And I know it's almost like maybe a little bit overstated sometimes, but like we don't get to see these guys in practice. Like they know what they're talking about in practice. They see them in the film room. If they're confident with Tony Adams' eyes in practice, if they're confident with him in the film room, he knows where he's supposed to be. That I could see them having faith in him. It's just hard for Jets fans because we haven't actually seen it on the field, and we are trained to expect the worst. So it's a possibility that he could be a really good player. Again, for me personally, I just can't. I'm not going to put all my chips into that basket, or all my eggs into Tony Adams' basket, because he's really the only like true free safety that I see on the team. Amos, I watched a lot of him in 2020 and then even in 2022, just because the grades were substantially different from 2020 to 2022. So I wanted to see if it was his play really dropping, or was he just the beneficiary of circumstance in 2020, or was he the victim of circumstance in 2022? And I think he was more the beneficiary of circumstance in 2020. So I don't really think he's like the best player in the world, and I think he is better in the box. So you have one player who's better in the box in Amos. You have another player who's obviously better in the box in Whitehead. So I think that spot's nicely filled between like the hybrid linebacker, strong safety. It's just in terms of true range free safety, it's Tony Adams, and that's it. And again, they have more information than I do. I've watched 2 games. I think he could be a good player. It's just a massive question mark. So if you can get insurances for that for $3 million in a John Johnson, then do it. Or like we were talking about initially, if you can bring Quan back, okay, then if he struggles at free safety, you kick Amos to free safety. I don't feel like he's great, but he's at least rosterable there. Like he's at least an okay player and an upgrade from LaMarcus Joyner, and then Quan kicks into the box, and we're kind of back where we were last year with a slight upgrade at safety. So it's kind of a loaded thing with that Quan signing.
Let's go to the defensive line swap-a-rooney. So this offseason, for the most part, the Jets are able to retain their core, but they do lose Sheldon Rankins and they lose Nathan Shepard. In comes in Quentin Jefferson and Al Woods. Was that an even-for-even swap? Did the Jets gain? Did the Jets lose? What's the tape say?
I think they gained if they use them properly. One of my biggest issues with Saleh, and we had some problems last year where some of the clock management. What was it, the Lions game? He didn't call that timeout. So we saw some problems with some of that stuff. But one of my biggest issues with Saleh, and it was Saleh both on the offensive side of the ball and the defensive side of the ball. How many plays were there? It was like 3rd and 1 in the red zone, and it was Nathan Shepard, Solomon Thomas, Michael Clemens, no offense to him, and another backup, Josh Martin or Jacob Martin on the edge. It's like, what are we doing here? So we got better talent than we had last year, but if Al Woods is going to be in short yardage situations and he's not going to be rushing the passer, and if Quentin Jefferson's going to be in 3rd and longs or passing situations, then yes, it's an upgrade, but you have to use them correctly. There cannot be any more of the hockey substitution lines. It just doesn't make sense. And to a certain point, I get the Jeff Ulbrich and Saleh want to rotate their defensive linemen a lot, but they're pouring a lot of value into some guys who aren't playing a lot of snaps, right? Like Q, we all expect him to get paid hopefully today, tomorrow, the next day. Let's just get that over with. But he's making $25 million to play 65% of the snaps like he was last year, where you have guys who are making $25 million really playing like 80 or 85%. So to a point, I think the heavy rotation is a little bit detrimental to the team because you want your best players to play. But I could live with it if they at least do it properly. Again, Al Woods, run situations. Quentin Jefferson, pass situations. It cannot be the whole rotations like it was last year. So I really, really like Woods in terms of stuffing the run. You've seen the highlights. The dude, just an absolute behemoth in there. Like a chip off the old block of like the Snacks Harrisons of the past, the Chris Jenkins that we've enjoyed as Jets fans. So he's of that ilk. And then Quentin Jefferson is really, really productive in limited or more of a limited role as a pass rusher. And stats aren't everything, but he was just as productive, if not better, than Sheldon Rankins as a pass rusher last year. It's just Sheldon Rankins is more well-rounded than Quentin Jefferson, but Al Woods is much better than Sheldon Rankins in the run game. So I think those two guys versus Sheldon Rankins and Nathan Shepard being minus as well is definitely an upgrade. It's just about how you use them if you use them properly. And it's the same thing with receiver, talking about that. There were some reps last year where it was, instead of Elijah Moore, Garrett Wilson, Corey Davis, it was Braxton Berrios, Denzel Mims, and Jeff Smith in the red zone. I'm like, what are we doing here? So they got to figure out the rotation thing for sure.
Let's you brought up Quinnen Williams. Let's get into him. How much better can he get? So he's inevitably going to get paid. We all believe as Jet fan, media people, whatever. We like obviously like let's pay the man. He's 25 years old. He's coming off this year. He was one of those late bloomers. He wasn't that Quinnen Williams saw last year immediately. It took him a little bit of time, and there was some contributing factors, injuries, and other things that kind of played a role in that. And then he's about to get the bag. Because I think there are a lot of Jet fans, and I know they're different situations, Joe, and I'm sorry to bring up this painful memory, but the last time the Jets paid one of their own, we're talking Muhammad Wilkerson, who in his first 5 years had 36.5 sacks, and he had the perfect story, grew up minutes from the facility. We're like, oh, this is the guy. We got to pay the guy. And franchise tag deadline style, they give him the big deal. They give him all the money, and then all of a sudden he doesn't give a flying hoot. Tardiness, production all falls off a cliff. So people were a little hesitant. Do you think if Quinnen gets the bag, there's a higher level to achieve here?
Yeah, so Quinnen Williams was a top 3 interior defensive lineman last year, and I think the argument's with him, it's with Simmons, it's with Donald, and I think Donald's dropping off a little bit. So I think Q is trying to reach to be the best, and I think Donald's again dropping off, so it's probably him versus Chris Jones, and there's some guys up there, Dexter Lawrence, who are creeping up a little bit, but Quinnen Williams took obviously a massive leap in his 4th year last year. So I think he can get a little bit better. There's just some technical things I think he could do a little bit better. I think he can rush, with better consistent leverage. But he was still dominant. Like, you could argue that he was the best last year. Again, how do you quantify it? You have to go back and watch every single rep of every single guy, which is quite hard to do unless you're doing this full time, which I'm not. I do have a full-time job, so I'm not able to do it. But yeah, I think Q's gonna be fighting for the best. And now I'm not really worried about him with like Muhammad Wilkerson, because the thing with Wilkerson is, and this is again stuff that we're not privy to because we don't have the behind the scenes access, is, we heard the rumblings of him at least after he was lazy. We heard, okay, well, prior to the actual rumblings coming out, he was missing meetings, he was late, and we haven't really heard anything like that about Q. So I think they're two just different people. And while Wilkerson was very good, he wasn't dominant. Williams was dominant last year at points. I've never seen Wilkerson get to that level. While he was very, very good, there's a different level between, again, more of like Christian Wilkins type player who are very good, but they're not Quinnen Williams. They're not Chris Jones. They're not, and I'm not comparing anybody to Aaron Donald, but Aaron Donald of today's Aaron Donald, different than Aaron Donald of 5 years ago. So I think he's going to be pushing to be the best. I think it's around that $25 million. We'll see exactly what the hang up is. We're all kind of thinking it's about the years right now, and it's not about the actual money, which is, by the way, something absolutely crazy in terms of the money and just contracts in New Jersey. I think the NFL should figure out a way to make it even for all teams in terms of the tax, because talk about Dalvin Cook. I don't know if Dalvin Cook's going to come up in a little bit, but how much does he have to get paid in New York to make the same contract or have the same actual money in his pocket as Miami? So it's a little bit crazy with how some of the contracts work, and maybe that hurts the Jets in some of their negotiations at time because of how damn high the taxes are. I know you live in the area as well. They're pretty ridiculous. So I think Q's gonna be fighting for the best. I think he could legitimately get there. A little bit of a late bloomer, but he was really young at Bama. That was his first year of really seeing a lot of snaps. But it's different at the NFL level, right? And I think he got like grown man strong at the NFL level, and he was more consistent with his technique. And now he's a top 3 interior defensive lineman who deserves to get paid, and hopefully it's before camp in a couple of weeks.
All right, let's get a couple more in here. So we'll go to the running back position, but before we get to Dalvin Cook, I just need an answer on this, because this is what I'm struggling with. I think there are so many question marks with the Jets backfield. So you have Breece Hall, obviously torn ACL, players recover differently, so you put him in a box, okay? Michael Carter, he was just trash last year. Now, I want you to be able to tell me if there's something I'm missing, but I just feel like the eye in this guy don't lie. 3.5 yards per carry. It was just sluggish. I don't even know how to explain it, so I'll give you the opportunity to do that in a second. Zonovan Knight, while he went crazy and then fizzled, and then Izzy's a day 3 pick. Like, I mean, I'm excited. There's some splash there. There's some home run hitting ability that kind of revs my engine. But I mean, when I say that, and there's people out there in the Jets universe saying the Jets running back room is loaded, overflowing, I'm like, I just don't see it. So what is your state of the state? Before we even get to Dalvin Cook, which kind of leads into it, but what is the state of the state as you see it with the running back position? Is there anything I said that's off base?
No, it's very volatile. Like, you're right. Like, Breece Hall can come back and be dominant, or it could take until week 12 and we're losing a couple of games because we don't have what Breece Hall was last year. We all hear that it takes a year from ACLs and Achilles, and what if it takes him that full year? So that's a massive question mark. Like you said, Michael Carter was very, very good in 2020 or 2021 and very bad in 2022. To me, that's the biggest question legitimately of the Jets roster is what happened to Michael Carter last year. I did plenty of reviews. I didn't actually watch him, but in passing of watching him and plenty of other players, it looked like he was the same Michael Carter for at least the first couple of weeks in terms of breaking tackles, because it's not anything with like vision or anything like that. It was just he did not break tackles like he did the prior years. So to me, it was either 2021 was a illusion in terms of him breaking tackles, or he was injured in 2020 or last year. So either way, it's still a really big question mark. He could either be really good again or really bad. I don't know if there's really a middle with Michael Carter.
Is there any validity? I just want to jump in real quick because this is what people have told me. When I go on this rant about Michael Carter, I'm yelling off. I'm the old man on the porch. They're like, Paul, the offensive line was depleted and injured. No one could have run. Barry Sanders couldn't have run on that offensive line. What say you to those people that have said that to me?
That's partially it, but I think people, and you know this, Paul, like you've been on social media a lot. It's either black or white. It's either really bad or really good. There's no in between.
Right.
But so there's in between there. It's Michael Carter not breaking tackles, not being as creative, not turning his legs, just not slipping off of guys like he did the year prior. And you have the Jets offensive line, which was down to like its 17th tackle at some points last year. So you're not going to be able to run so much. So I think it's both, to be honest, to straddle the fence there a little bit, but for Carter individually, he just didn't break as many tackles as he did, so he needs to start breaking some tackles this year if he even makes the roster. Because if we're going to bring in Dalvin Cook, it's either going to be a Michael Carter or a Zonovan Knight who's not on the roster, because I got bad news. You're not carrying 5 running backs. It's just not happening. So so Michael Carter is a massive question. Is a question. Now I know that hit rates for running backs are higher in later rounds, and that's why a lot of teams smartly draft a running back every year because you're going to eventually hit on one. But Izzy, while he has some enticing traits, he could be a bust, right? Like I know a lot of fans want to talk about their players like they're going to be the next, Barry Sanders, but realistically, a 5th round running back can be a bust, right? Like we're not going to be shocked. Now, while I'm not going to say he will be that, it's obviously a possibility. He would have been taken in the 1st round if he wasn't, if he was a surefire guy, and obviously guys in the 1st round aren't even surefire guys. Look at Trent Richardson, for example.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a possibility that he doesn't hit, and he's very volatile too, where he's a guy who will frustrate you. He'll get 1 yard, 1 yard, 1 yard, 25 yards. So he needs to be more consistent with his down to down rushing to make it in the NFL level, in my opinion. And then, like you said, with Bam, it was good for a couple of weeks, and then it was really bad for a couple of weeks. And I think part of that was definitely the offensive line. Especially with a younger back who's not really used to picking up holes and knowing how to set up his holes as well, pressing a hole to cut back, whatever it may be. It's going to be really hard when you have an offensive line that's as bad as it is. So I think Zonovan Knight's actually a pretty decent backup, but it's still a question because he could just fizzle out too. Like the running back positions are so volatile in general. And I'm not saying I think this is more because of injury, but like look at James Robinson, look what he was and then what he wasn't. And again, there's injuries that are tied into that, but running backs fizzle out very, very quickly in the NFL. And again, while saying that Zonovan Knight, I think is a solid backup, that you still need more of that because Izzy could fizzle out. Michael Carter could fizzle out. It could take weeks, if not a year, for Breece Hall to be Breece Hall. So it could be very, very good or bad or somewhere in the middle, but it's definitely not a lock at like a top 5 running back group in the NFL at this point.
All right, this leads us to Dalvin Cook, and I'll be honest, I have no idea what your take is on this, so this will be fun. I just have to say, I feel like sometimes analytics have a place. Obviously, Jets X Factor, it speaks for itself. But like analytics have a place. But I just feel like sometimes the nerds in the back of the room, as I overgeneralize, they're just overcomplicating something. For me, as I look at Dalvin Cook, I look at the last 4 years and say, wow, he's one of the most productive running backs in the NFL. And I've seen some of the numbers, like he's only behind Derrick Henry in this or this or this. So again, elite category. And I know you don't pay guys for what they've done in the past. I'm just saying, well, look at this in the most recent rearview mirror, and he's 27. I'm like, I know he turns 28 before the season, but I look at that and say, I mean, I don't think we need to overcomplicate this. This is one of the most productive running backs in the NFL, and he would be an upgrade over any of the guys in the room. Sounds pretty good to me. Where do you stand, Joe? Because I've heard a lot of analytical people point to, well, look at this trending stat. Look at this. Look at, some of these numbers. And I'm just like, man, I feel like sometimes, you're in the forest, can't see the trees kind of thing.
Yeah, no, and I know the EPA and all that stuff that people bring up with
Yes.
Cook, and to be transparent, like it happens a lot where I could see stats on a player and I go and watch him, like, oh, this guy's completely different than what I thought he was. Like I heard Jordan Whitehead, based on all the stats, was a very good tackler. I went back and watched his 2021 tape, and he missed like 3 tackles on Cordell Patterson in the first game of the Bucs season. And I'm like, okay, so analytics are wrong on that one, clearly. And analytics, again, who are judging these plays? Like that's my problem with a lot of these people, because I don't know what their film background is. I don't see them put up plays.
Sure.
I don't know how they diagnose things. And analytics have their place, but they're also extremely flawed at times too. And obviously get more into like the advanced stuff. But like how do you quantify? Okay, a pick where you're throwing into double coverage, or a pick where I throw it and it hits the receiver in the chest, it bounces off into a linebacker's hands, and it's a pick. Are both picks created equal? Obviously not. The one was a good process, bad result. The one was both bad process and bad result. Or I just saw something the other day with analytics. I'll get into a whole rant, but like for coverage grades for them, if the guy who is getting a coverage grade doesn't get targeted, it's just a neutral play. So every single play that you're not targeted is a neutral play. So you could have 60 plays in a game, you can get burned for 55 of them, but because you weren't targeted, it doesn't count. It's like, obviously that's a stretch, but you feel what I'm saying.
No, I gotcha.
So analytics have their place. And I could watch him and obviously think the numbers are completely different, and watching a little bit of him, because like everybody, you hear Dalvin Cook, you're going to go to YouTube, you're going to watch his most recent year's highlights. Like that's what I did. And he still looked pretty fast to me. Like he still looked twitchy. He still looked good. Now with that being said, again, I could go back and be more in line with what the analytics are saying, but you also have to factor in with Dalvin Cook, he did have a shoulder injury too, which is hard to run over guys when you have a shoulder injury at running back, obviously, guys who are 250 pounds. So I'm more in the middle on Cook. Because again, just for transparency's sake, I haven't watched enough of him to really have a strong take. I can go back, we could sign him like, oh, this is great. Go back and watch him like, oh crap, or vice versa. Like I remember, and this is a perfect example of it. Years ago, when the Jets were apparently going to sign Anthony Barr, and then he went away from the Jets. I think the next morning we figured out, like we woke up to no Anthony Barr, and I remember the night we signed him, I went and watched his like first 3 games. I'm like, like he is not very good to what his numbers say. I'm like, this is a bad signing. And then, a couple of hours later, it's like, oh, we didn't sign. I'm like, oh, thank God. So the numbers can definitely lie. Undoubtedly, like I fight the numbers because I just do the film. Like I think there's a place for it, but numbers for me is more like, where does a guy line up? How many snaps did they take here? But in terms of grading stuff, I take no account for the numbers, just because I trust myself more. But so with Cook, I'm more in the middle, just because even if he did have a down year and his numbers are bad, I'm still going to pour more into his resume, or more faith into his resume, than a Michael Carter or Zonovan Knight at this point. So obviously, if the price is right, I'm again on the fence, but I would be okay with him doing it, or okay with him not doing it, to straddle the fence. But that's really my honest take. With all of that. Now the question is, who do they cut if they do bring him in, and what is the price? Because again, I want to figure it out, but is $7 million here, $5 million in Miami? So how much do we have to outbid Miami? And again, the fact that there's no rule for that in the NFL, it drives me absolutely crazy. But nonetheless, what is the price? If we're talking $7, $8, $9 million, okay, maybe a little bit too much. But if we can get him for 4, 5, 6, okay, now we're talking. Because what's the difference between him and some other guys out there? Kareem Hunt. I know he had some down numbers last year as well. But if you can get him for 3 and Cook for 6 or 7, is that difference doesn't mean enough. So sure. I'm down for bringing another running back. It just depends on the price and exactly who it is.
Fair enough. All right, let's get the last one in here. Of course, we got to get Aaron Rodgers. It's been weird how in all these recent interviews, Aaron Rodgers just kind of found his way in the back. Maybe because he's always in the front. So it's just getting used to it, pal. But obviously, you just dropped an article. People can check it out. It was from earlier this morning about Aaron Rodgers' production decline in 2022. And I think Buffalo, who obviously very well, Buffalo made a great point on the show that, so Aaron Rodgers has this thumb injury. He decides to play through it. And then obviously the results aren't what normal Aaron Rodgers is. And we all say, well, look at this scrub. He fell off the cliff. But Buffalo said, man, if he had the thumb injury and just decided to pack it in, our previous knowledge of Aaron Rodgers would have been winning back-to-back MVPs. And how would our perception have changed, and maybe the trade price potentially have changed when you fast forward it later? So factoring that in potentially into the conversation, is the decline solely thumb? Is it age? Because Jet fans, Aaron Rodgers, Pro Football Hall of Famer. That's all I see. Last year, what? I don't know anything of what you're talking about.
Yeah, of course. And I still think he is the same guy. Now, did he lose some mobility? Yeah, but he never thrived off of mobility. So it's like you heard, I don't know exactly what practice it was, but there was reporters like saying that he was throwing a ball 60, 65 yards while not even stepping into it. So his arm is not gone. Like even after the thumb injury, I was seeing balls that were, thrown 65 yards while not even fully stepping into it. It's like, Jesus, like the guy can definitely still whip it. So, but the thing with like the NFL too is just like, even if your thumb is broken or fractured, I think he fractured his thumb, which whatever.
Yes,
Again, I'm not a doctor, but like the littlest bit of difference of touch, it can completely change a play. A ball 2 or 3 yards to the inside, or even just 6 inches to the inside, can completely change the result from a.
It was just throwing hand, yeah,
to a perfectly placed back shoulder ball. So you're going to lose some touch. Now, on top of that, you have players, and again, I'm very transparent in my reviews, and some people hate it because I'm very honest about Jets players, and we've been really shitty in the past. I'm like, yeah, these players suck. People are like, you're too negative. It's like, no, there's a reason we were 3-13. We kind of sucked. But with Rodgers, and that's not to say that I'm going to be negative on Rodgers right now, because I'm more positive, because you see after the thumb injury, you see him start to throw balls a little bit shorter than normal, but he still had the ability to throw the ball deep. So that's a touch thing. I saw some balls hang a little bit more to the inside. Again, just more of a touch thing because his thumb was fractured. Now, on top of that, you also obviously have a big, subtraction from the team in Devontae Adams. And there was clearly some signs of him not trusting his offensive line and his receivers to me, because there was plenty of seam balls that he would throw to tight ends in years past that he just did not throw this year, whether that be not trusting the receiver or the tight end who's actually running the route, or the offensive line. Sometimes there were sometimes his eyes dropped and looked at the rush where they wouldn't typically see it. And I think that's because his offensive line was a little bit banged up. And in terms of the receivers, you have to, you hear so much about Rodgers' connections with the receivers and with the offensive line and guys knowing where they're supposed to be. But when you're running out there with guys like Romeo Doubs, who's a rookie, and Christian Watson, who are rookies, it's hard to have that chemistry, knowing where to put that back shoulder ball. Or, Rodgers actually likes to hang balls a little bit more to the inside sometimes and let receivers attack it instead of like the typical back shoulder ball. So, how comfortable is he with those guys? So there's all of that, the chemistry, the injury, but then there's also just the fact of the guys around him weren't great at the same time. I put up the review, and the first play of his season, he throws a ball to Christian Watson that should have been an 80-yard touchdown, and he just drops it. And there was plenty of plays. There was Romeo Doubs drops. There was Christian Watson drops. There was Robert Tonyan, who got way overpaid, in my opinion, for the Bears, watching him the last couple of years. But I reviewed 200 plus. I think I reviewed 200 plays of Rodgers. Like I had a pretty good feel of what he was, and I didn't see that much of a different guy post thumb injury. I still see the arm. I saw a lack of trust in the offensive line. I saw a lack of trust in the receivers. And did he regress a little bit? Yeah, but that happens when you fracture your thumb and you don't have faith in your guys. So, the numbers say what, was it 26 picks and 12 touchdowns, I think, or 12. Oh, sorry, 26 touchdowns, 12 picks. If it was the other way, we'd be concerned. We'd be concerned if it was 26 picks and 12 touchdowns.
Yeah, it was 26 and 12.
Yeah. So, but with that being said, okay, if Watson catches that ball, if there was a couple of other catches, I'm not talking like saying, oh, well, if nobody ever dropped the ball, he would have 40 touchdowns. I'm just saying if it was to the mean, if it was normal level drops, he probably has 32 touchdowns. And then we're talking about 32 touchdowns, 11 picks. It's like, okay, a little bit of a down year, but not so drastically down. So there's reasons that his stats were bad. Combination of the injury, combination of the offensive line, the receivers, a little bit of him as well. But it wasn't something where I'm thinking we're going to get like a washed up Rodgers. He might be 95% of MVP Rodgers, which I'm completely okay with.
Yeah, and by the way, I just have to put it out in the universe. There's a lot of things that can happen with this Jet season, obviously. But Aaron Rodgers being washed is like not even in my mind. And sure, I'm the most optimistic guy in the world, so I fully understand that. But just like my brain can't even compute that as a possibility. So I just feel like Rodgers is going to be good, but we'll ultimately see. I lied, Joe. There is one more, and I don't even know if you can answer this. If you can, I guess you probably wouldn't be talking to me on a Monday night. But nonetheless, Laken Tomlinson. I just don't understand. Same position, same system. The Jets felt so good about it. Like, hey, ABT, flip your ass over to the other side. Like, they set it up as perfectly as can be, and obviously it didn't translate, which, again, to me, I am so high on Laken going into next year. Like, it can't possibly happen again because I can't even explain how the first thing happened. Have you been able to uncover anything on why that happened? Because literally it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. Like, it just doesn't make sense. And sometimes there's not a reason for it. Sometimes a system change, whatever it may be, a change of scenery, and a guy just not as comfortable. It looked like there was more communication problems than he had with San Francisco. There's sometimes he was chasing blocks a little bit more than he was in San Francisco. So I don't know if it was a thing where like he wanted to prove himself as like some leader, some tough guy, and he was chasing blocks a little bit. But it seemed like miscommunication. It seemed like maybe he was reaching a little bit just to be better than he really was. But it's a really hard question to answer. I think those are probably the two biggest questions of the Jets offseason, or actually probably three. It's probably Becton, Tomlinson, what the hell happened, and then I forgot the third that we were asking. But Tony Adams might be the other one I was thinking about.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, it's really weird because it's not now. I think he was always a little bit overrated by fans. Like I don't think he was always like again, how do you quantify Pro Bowl? Because like anybody can make the Pro Bowl. You had Huntley make the Pro Bowl last year, I believe his name is, whatever the Ravens backup is. Like it doesn't really matter some years because it's more of like a popularity vote. So with that being said, do I think he's a little bit overrated coming to the Jets? Yes, but I still thought he was solid, and he went from solid to absolute doo doo. So you're hoping for something again. Get really high or somewhat high, really low. Again, get to the middle, and then he's an average guard, and then we're talking. Still an absurd contract, $15-16 million for an average guard, but at least he's not going to be absolute crap where he's passable. So to me, again, it was communication, and maybe he just wasn't as comfortable with the scheme. And I know I could have a better feel if I went and watched him every single rep for 17 games in a row. That's not something I would do because there'd be like 3 people who would watch it because nobody really cares about Laken Tomlinson anymore. So I didn't do it, but yeah, I think you're going to have a bounce back just because legitimately I don't think he could be much worse than he was last year.
All right, fair enough. Joe, it's been too gosh darn long, quite frankly. We got to make sure it's not every 3 years. And the next time I see you, you're going to have a white beard, and who knows where the hell I'm going to be. But before we get you out of here, Joe, feel free to plug whatever the hell you want. You've got a lot of great things cooking right now.
Yeah, Jets X Factor, the most simple thing. Blewett Splits on YouTube. JoeRB31 on Twitter. Again, we're heavily based in analytics and in film. So if you really want to get to know the players and know their strengths and weaknesses and know techniques and know coverages and know why a guy is good or bad, you come here. And I get that's not everybody's cup of tea. Some people like the generic stuff, but if you are that guy who likes the diehard film and analytics, that's your niche, then we're the site for you.
There you are. Joe Blewett joining us here on the show. Everybody, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.